Shalom and welcome to the Middle East Report. In this program today, we'll be discussing what has been happening in Israel over the past few weeks, what's happening in the United States, and are we moving closer to the pre-trib rapture? And in this program today, I am joined by William Koenig, who is a US White House correspondent, together with the author of the book Eye to Eye and a good friend. Bill, warm welcome to the Middle East Report, and it's great to see you.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure. Bill, where do we start? We so much has happened over the last couple of months. Is absolutely extraordinary. What's happened in Israel, what's happened in the Middle East, what's happened in the United States as well. And if I take Israel, for example, over the past a few months, we've had, for example, the Mount Merman tragedy, which over 45 Orthodox Jews and boys died in that horrendous stampede with 150 injured. That was considered the worst national tragedy to hit Israel in peacetime. This is combined with all the violent riots and demonstrations that we saw on the Temple Mount and Jerusalem being directed at Israel. This was then combined with Hamas firing over 4,000 rockets and missiles into Israel. And of course, then we have the reaction of your administration in the States, President Biden, his kind of indifference and this kind of moral equivalence that we saw with so many of the front bench of President Biden's Democratic team, essentially putting Israel on the same moral parity as Hamas. How do you explain all these extraordinary events that we have witnessed in the last few weeks, Bill?
This fits a eye-to-eye pattern of a period of disruption. When it started January 28th last year, when President Trump and Netanyahu were at the White House to introduce Trump's Peace to Prosperity plan, through the summer up to the Abraham Accords being signed at the White House on September 15th, into the election, and since the inauguration, we're in a period of disruption. Those things that you mentioned, those are very disruptive things. They affect on the psyche, the soul of Israel, and same here in the United States. We have a lot of disruption politically and other things that we're concerned about. So this definitely fits a pattern when you're not in sync with the Lord, when you're attempting to divide his land and create an Arab state out of Judea and Samaria. Things just don't go well.
I think that's a very good analogy as well. So if we start back at the beginning of the year, Bill, we're seeing that Israel won so many international plaudits around the world. Israel was actually getting decent media coverage for once on Israel's handling of COVID-19, the pandemic, its ability to vaccinate most of its population. And then we see also that in Britain, for example, Israel was added to the green passport list, meaning that you could go to Israel without having to quarantine for 10 days either side of that trip. And it looked like people were seeing a different side of Israel, that there could be a huge possibility that foreign tourists could visit Israel, and that Israel would come out of this global pandemic COVID-19 as one of the most strongest nations. But now we see that the world again has turned against Israel, and we've almost seen like the jealousies of the Palestinian Authority, Hamas, the Iranians not wanting to get Israel, allow Israel to have any good public relations. What would you see in terms of why we're seeing this rise of hatred against Israel again, and how that nice short period of time where Israel was getting good media coverage has come to an end?
Well, when that happens, that's usually when the Palestinians start doing things. They don't want to see that. They don't want to see the positive press about the Israelis. The other thing is they're looking for a problem. There were some Palestinians who were living in homes that hadn't paid rent for years, and basically Israel says pay the rent. I mean, the Israeli owners pay the rent, or if not, then you will be evicted. So that was a catalyst. Plus TikTok, the Chinese-owned TikTok, started creating disruption between the Israelis and Palestinians, and that led to some hatred and animosity, and that started playing out in the social network. So that was another catalyst. And then usually when Hamas is politically weak, in some ways they're strong because Abbas was concerned if the election had gone through. He used the excuse they couldn't get people to vote in East Jerusalem. But what happens is it looked like Hamas might have gained more seats in the parliament after 14, 15 years since the last election. So a lot of times when Hamas needs money, they'll go and start firing rockets at Israel. They'll get into conflict, and all of a sudden the international community will come forward with billions and billions of dollars to help rebuild these cities that were damaged by Israeli self-defense rockets and missiles and bombs. And it's a pattern that goes over and over again. So two things, again, summarizing, there was a lot of positive Israeli news, and Hamas was desperate financially, and the Palestinians were also looking at another opportunity to attempt to get the international community onto their side as Israel responded in force in protection of their cities and their people.
And Bill, we know that the main instigators in this recent conflict against Israel was the Islamic Republic of Iran. But how much can we put the blame on your President Biden and his policies towards the Middle East by wanting to re-engage the Iranian regime, bring them back into the fold, and have a new Iranian nuclear deal, taking the Saudi Sunni terrorist organization in Yemen off the terrorist list, and then wanting also then to refund the Palestinian Authority, give them the diplomatic leverage that President Trump suspended, certainly, suspending their funds and their funding for their campaign. I think the amounts to something like over 600 million US dollars. And do you think that these factors have contributed to this massive upsurge in violence and terrorism that we're seeing being directed against Israel?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Great points. Because what happened is when you look at the Trump White House, they stopped the funding. They didn't want the money going to these UNRWA schools that were nothing but problematic. David Badin from Israel's done a great job of covering the incitement in those schools, and they just shut them off. They said, look, you start acting like a international player, you start acting like a responsible government, and we'll deal with you. And until then, we're going to shut off the bucks. So what happened is the Biden administration got involved in the UN Human Rights Council again actively, international criminal courts, where Trump and his administration was very strong and very adamant about them and their treatment of Israel, and then started giving the money to the Palestinians. And in some ways, this empowered them. And they're also people in the Middle East. I mean, look how calm, for the most part, the Middle East was during Trump's 4 years in office. He carried a heavy hand. He didn't put up with stuff. And they knew it, and they didn't test him. They didn't know what he would do, but they'd tell you one thing they did. They didn't want to test him. They don't respect Biden, just like they didn't respect Obama, especially after Obama, along with the P5+1 partners there in Europe, cut the Iran nuclear deal. So no, he's being tested in many ways. At the same time, he's considered a weak leader, and no one really knows who's calling the shots here in Washington. There's some speculation, but he's not all there. So this is a very vulnerable period for America, for Israel, and for our allies in the Middle East.
No, absolutely. I suppose what comes to mind the most, Bill, is the fact that we see that President Biden says that he's a friend of Israel, but when we, as Christians, we need to look at the fruits. What are the fruits? And he has not condemned Hamas. He didn't even mention Hamas. almost saying that this is implying it's a tit for tat confrontation between Israel and Hamas and the Palestinians, and is now, after this conflict, looking to spend billions of US aid money, which is your nation's taxpayers' money, on trying to rebuild the infrastructure in Gaza, which we know Hamas will just use this to rebuild their rocket supplies, rebuild their terror tunnels. And again, we're back in this vicious circle again, aren't we?
Absolutely. There's no doubt about it. Another problem we have too here, Simon, is the support for Israel on Capitol Hill among the Democrats is not very good now, and it's not getting any better. As a matter of fact, I saw a poll. I think it was in the Jerusalem Post this morning that said in America, half the Democrats support Israel and half the Democrats support the Palestinian cause. Where for us as conservatives and Republicans, we still, when it comes to the senators and congressmen, they overwhelmingly support Israel. There is no doubt who Israel's best friend is. That is the conservatives, Republicans in Capitol Hill, as well as evangelical Christians across this country. So because of Biden's position, because of some of the people in the Democratic Party, these progressives, the support that AIPAC spent many years, many dollars lobbying over the years is diminishing. And that's going to be a big problem going forward for Israel, and especially with this weak administration.
Can you explain to us, really? I mean, this has been a process that's been going on for the last 2 decades, I think, and that is that, for example, when Bill Clinton was president, he shifted the Democrats to the center right, adopting many of the policies of the Republicans, just as Tony Blair did in this country, stole a lot of the conservatives' policies and clothing in order to get elected. And now it seems like since then we've seen the political or the centre left go further and further to the left. Same we've seen in our nation with the rise of Jeremy Corbyn, who is a vile in terms of his hatred and venom against Israel. Can't even mention the word Israel. Became the leader of Her Majesty's opposition. And now we're seeing this in the same with the Democrat Party, that they've shifted so much to the left. And of course, a big component of the left is this hatred of Israel and support for the Palestinian cause that is essentially baseless, because there's more, let's explain this. There's more shared values in supporting a democratic nation that supports women's rights and all liberal rights in Israel, compared to that of the Palestinian Authority and Hamas, who essentially adhere to extreme Islamic values.
Yeah, the political division in America has never been worse. I've done some commentary on this. Part of the problem, it's a sin agenda. The Democratic Party stands for LGBTQ. They stand for abortion. They stand for illegal immigration. They are trying to create this racial division in our country that, for many ways, doesn't exist. And it's this systemic racism thing is another divisive thing. And Biden and his people have really been called out this last week, especially after his speech in Tulsa, that said, stop this division. This is ridiculous. This isn't healthy. It's not doing anything to bring us together. So we really have a distinct difference between the political parties today. You made a great point. Clinton worked toward the middle. There was some compromise. But this Democratic Party is going further to the left. The progressives, that word is so crazy anyhow. Progressive what? Progress? I don't see any progress. It just keeps getting worse and worse and worse. And we're living in a time, as Isaiah 5:20 speaks of, when good is considered evil and evil is considered good. And again, woe to those who call evil good and good evil. And that's what's happening. And that's having an effect on everything. And there's no, and what has happened, Simon, we're at a point right now that neither side will give any territory. We cannot give up any more territory than we already have, because America is dramatically changing because of this division, and it's unfortunate. It's very sad, but it's a moral issue. And it also has when you look at the Israeli-Palestinian situation, Israel just wants to be left in peace and security. They just want to be allowed to be a productive member of the international community. But they've got a problem. It's Palestinians, it's Hamas, it's Hezbollah, it's Iran. And, I think what happened last year, some of the Middle Eastern countries said, Israel's not coming here to try to take over Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates or Bahrain. That's not their interest. They want to be a productive member of the Middle East. And as you and I know, too, ironically, these Middle Eastern countries are very concerned about their peace and security. And they don't know. They knew they couldn't trust Obama. They're very comfortable with Trump. And now they're very concerned about their future with the Biden administration. And so it's a very difficult, divisive, challenging period of time. Lots happening politically here in America. And this division, and then you look again, it's amazing how the parallels between U.S. political situation and the Israeli political situation many times track disruption there, disruption here. Good times here, good times there. And right now, it's a very disruptive political time in the United States and certainly as well as in Israel.
No, absolutely, Bill. I just wondered what you thought of Ron Dermer's comments. Now, he's the former Israeli ambassador to the United States. He actually said that Israel should strategically recognize that evangelical Christians are Israel's best friends in the United States, and that Israel can no longer rely on American Jewry. I mean, that is an extraordinary statement to make. So what do you make of his comments on how Israel should form a new strategic alliance with evangelical Christians and bypass more of the liberal American Jewry?
Excellent point. Yeah, Ron Dermer, as ambassador, Israel's ambassador to the U.S., did more to improve a already good relationship with the evangelical community than any ambassador. He spoke in many churches. He spoke in our church. He is extremely well liked throughout the United States, throughout the evangelical community. He is absolutely right. I remember years ago, I was up at JFK Airport to meet Chaim Richman with the Temple Mount Institute. And he'd just been on a 3-week speaking tour to the Jewish community about the Temple Mount, all the things that they'd planned to do with the future temple. And he says, we have hardly any support or hardly any interest. Our support, our interest comes from the evangelical community. He was perplexed. He just had a 3-week tour and the response was just lukewarm at best. But he was so appreciative of the fact that I was up there, my wife was up there, to show a sign of support and the desire to reach out more to the evangelical community. So here you got a guy like Ron Dermer, who's so well respected, who's strong enough and bold enough to say exactly that. And that's another thing that is what we've seen here in Congress, Simon, that I just mentioned. We're seeing that support diminish while the evangelical support is getting stronger and stronger for Israel than ever before. And I give Ron Dermer a lot of credit for helping that, and he's trying to improve that even beyond his time in office.
And Bill, as of the recording of this program, it looks like Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu will be out of power for the first time in 12 years. Looks like a new coalition is being formed, made up of Naftali Bennett, who was, I think, Bibi's former Minister of Education. He certainly has been such a strong supporter of the Jewish settlers and is considered to be more right than Bibi on the political spectrum, together with Yair Lapid, who represents that classic liberal position on the left. But in order to form a government, they need to make up the seats in order to form a government. There is a prospect that they could bring in the Rama Party, which is essentially the Muslim Brotherhood, or effectively means that in this new government, Hamas would have a seat on the table with the Israeli government. You can't write this script. And how is Israel blindly going into this direction right now with this so much political confusion? It seems that everyone has lost their kind of moral bearing, as it were. And this does put Israel's security under real threat and scrutiny.
It's a nightmare coalition. It's the craziest thing. like you said, just like we can't even believe that this is actually happening. A couple of points here. Netanyahu made a good point. It said if Bennett had ran in telling people that he had interest in possibly developing a coalition with the liberals, the labor, and the Arabs, he'd have never got his 6 seats. And when in Israel, if you ever had a prime minister, he'd be prime minister for 2 years that only has 6 members in the Knesset. It's a compromise. And here's the thing: is number one is, will they be able to allot the cabinets satisfactorily to form the government? Let's say they do. It could be one of the shortest living coalitions in history, because they only have a 1-person majority. They have 61 Knesset members, this coalition. So it's very vulnerable. One person bails, it's a collapsed government, and to the 5th election. So right now, we don't know if they're going to be able to develop the cabinets and be able to get this sworn in next Wednesday. And if they do, then I don't think it's going to be around that long. I mean, I guarantee you got these 4 Arabs that are Muslim Brotherhood supported, part of an Israeli coalition. Well, I mean, here, and the other thing, as you mentioned, Bennett was a big supporter of the settlement communities. He said the whole Area C should be annexed. All of that should be annexed. Well, is he going to change that position? So this is a really peculiar effort. And I think another thing is this desire to see someone besides Bibi as prime minister of Israel has led to a very peculiar, problematic, dangerous coalition that could really come back to haunt Israel going forward.
Absolutely. So let's have a look at this excellent CBN reports entitled "Opponents Try and Oust Bibi."
Members of the coalition called it a new beginning.
Today, we succeeded. We made history. We held our promise, as we always promised you, to tell the truth and to do what we said we will do. Tonight, we've succeeded.
The coalition of parties from right, center, left, and for the first time in Israel's history, an Arab Islamist party united around the main goal of bringing down Prime Minister Netanyahu.
Throughout the last campaign and also for the last 2 months, I reiterated and promised that the Labour Party would make every effort to form a government that would replace the Netanyahu regime.
Bennett, a religious conservative and a former ally of Netanyahu, and Lapid, a leader of the secular left, agreed to rotate the office of Prime Minister, with Bennett going first for 2 years and then Lapid for 2 years. Yet it's uncertain this fragile coalition will last that long, and if their common animosity towards Netanyahu will be enough to keep their government together. The 8 parties in the coalition represent ideologies from opposing ends of the political spectrum. Former U.S. ambassador to Israel told CBN News the question is if they can work together.
This is a very unusual government as it is laid out because while they are unified as a coalition, they've never been unified in terms of the political principles upon which they have built their parties. So what I'm waiting to find out really is, not what is the unity that brought them together, because we all know that's relatively shallow, but what are the unifying principles upon which they will govern?
The agreement still needs to be approved by a Knesset vote early next week. If sworn in, it will prevent the country from going to its 5th election in just more than 2 years and end the 12-year rule of Netanyahu, the longest-serving prime minister in Israel's history.
Great report there put together by Chris Mitchell. I mean, one thing I think the big question we have to really raise, and this is not only Israel's problem, but it's one in the West. Why does Israel and why do many Western nations give political legitimacy to an ideology that actually wants to destroy the very fabric of our democracy and our freedoms? So, for example, in Israel's case, they have a party called the Arab List Party, and then it's become the Rama Party, that is essentially against the existence of the State of Israel and wants to replace it with an Islamic theocracy. just as we see that Hamas is controlling Gaza, just like the Iranian regime. And of course, this party has support from the PLO, has support from Hamas, and even the Iranian regime itself. And it's okay to give people political freedom, but to allow them to stand in elections and have representatives who hold these views, surely that's a danger to democracy and freedom itself.
It's a chaos. It's just total chaos. It might look fine right now, but you know how that operates. The end justifies means, so they'll just be calm and compassionate, or compassionate is not probably the right word, conciliatory. But you know what happens? It'll be chaos. I can't imagine anything but chaos, and that's not going to be good for Israel. It's going to be putting them in a very vulnerable position, and especially right now with their problems with Iran and Hezbollah. And you know, the Iranians, those Persians are very, very smart, very strategic, and very patient. So this is a very precarious period of time. When you look at the danger, the problematic things that are happening in Turkey with Erdogan, as well as Russia moving a couple nuclear jets into this airport in Syria. The things that are happening with Iran right now. It's a very precarious time, and unfortunately, that anti-Semitic root. It's interesting. Ron Dermer said years ago. He said the anti-Semitic root has not died, and it hadn't surfaced. This is like 8 or 10 years ago when he said this. He said it still exists and it's laid dormant since the Holocaust. But I think what we're seeing right now, this is an end time scenario. We're seeing that anti-Semitic root in Europe and other parts of the world surface, and that also doesn't bode well for Israel going forward. How can the international community continue to provide billions and billions of dollars to the terrorist organization that operates within the Palestinians? There's a lot of Palestinians that are very decent people, but unfortunately, as you know, Simon, the leadership of the Palestinians for 20 plus years and beyond has taken advantage of their people. And at the same time, been able to extract billions of dollars and euros from the international community to help them out.
And Bill, maybe we should elaborate on this one, because the issue of Jew hatred is God's warning sign to the nation.
Yes,
that
that's right.
We're in serious trouble. Once the Jewish people are in trouble, then what first starts with the Jews never finishes with the Jews. In other words, this imperils Western civilization.
That's right.
I've been thinking recently, when we've seen these large international surges of anti-Semitism, they've been on the tipping point of something major taking place. So, yeah, if we go back to the 19th century, for example, we saw Theodor Herzl cover the story of the Dreyfus affair as an Austrian journalist in Paris, and of course Paris was considered the most liberal city, and also France was the most liberal city in the entire Western world. And we saw that Dreyfus, who was serving in the French army, was betrayed and accused of spying for France's enemies, the Prussians or the Germans, and a fake trial took place. And we saw an unprecedented rise of Jew hatred in France, which led Theodor Herzl to write his book, Der Judenstaat. So the answer to the problem of anti-Semitism is to create a Jewish state. And then we saw that was a major tipping point for pushing forward for the emergence of the State of Israel. Then in the 1930s, with the rise of fascism and Nazism on the continent of Europe, and of course we know what happened in the Holocaust, that over 6 million precious Jewish lives were murdered at the hands of the Nazis. We saw then that after the Holocaust, there was international sympathy for Jewish self-determination in building the Jewish state. Now, 80 years on, in our generation and our time, we are reaching unprecedented levels of Jew hatred. So I suppose the big question is, are we on the verge of something very, very big that's connected towards Israel? Or could this be actually what the Bible describes as the time of Jacob's trouble?
Yeah, I'm very concerned. What we saw during this recent conflict with Hamas is the Black Lives Matter leadership here in America was very supportive of the Palestinians. And we saw what they can do and have done to cities across America through their protest. And what we're hearing is the Palestinians watch this and are using some of the same technique within the Israeli community, something that Israel has not had a problem with in the past. And this is a great concern to Israel right now, that this method of protest and disruption will be taken to Israeli communities throughout the country. And what we saw here in about 48 hours, we had 8 different incidents across the United States where Jewish diners, Jewish people in public were targeted by protesters, disrupted. It happened all across the country in 8 different cities. And then we heard some of those things happen in your country, in the UK, and also in France. So there's always, we're living in a very disruptive period of time. COVID has created a lot of internal animosity. We're seeing people behave a lot differently here, whether it's on airline flights or just in public. It's a period of disruption. I think you're saying the same thing in Europe. And unfortunately, then they look to the weakest, and a lot of times they'll tee off on yarmulke wearing Jews, and that's a concern, Simon. And like you said, it'll start with them, and it'll work out to others as well. So that's a concern. Obviously, this is part of the disruption, division that's very diabolic, and that we'll see more and more of that going forward. And I tell you what, the Israelis and the Jews in Israel and also the United States, they certainly appreciate the evangelical support as well as they do in Europe. They can't thank us enough for being there for them, because they look to us as their only true friend at this time, with the division, even in the Jewish community.
No, absolutely, which is scary prospects. Let's have a look at this report now put together by CBN that says shocking rise in anti-Semitism sparked by Israel's war against Hamas.
Phone video of attacks against Jews in cities across the U.S. shared on social media show how Palestinian supporters are bringing the war against Israel and against Jews to America's streets. Jews around the world know that when Israel is attacked and fights back, they become even bigger targets for violence. A Jewish man was savagely beaten in New York's Diamond District, another in Times Square. Police are looking for these suspects. In Los Angeles, a man is being held on suspicion of assault with a deadly weapon after an anti-Semitic attack on Jewish diners. 10 cars full of Palestinian supporters rolled up and tried to attack them as they ate outside in Beverly Hills. Police are investigating the incident as a hate crime. In Canada, a Jew attacked in broad daylight. And in Florida, this pro-Palestinian caravan says Hitler was right. Rabbi Abraham Cooper of the Simon Wiesenthal Center.
The language of the caravans that are going through Jewish areas with anti-Semitic slogans being spat, and we're going to rape your wives and children and things like that. There's a sense that it's open season and fair game against Jews.
The Anti-Defamation League has documented anti-Semitism on multiple social media platforms, including 17,000 tweets which used variations of the phrase "Hitler was right," and 193 anti-Semitic incidents in the week after the fighting in the Middle East began. Rabbi Cooper says statements by Palestinian supporters in the Democrat Party embolden anti-Semites.
When the squad members, openly lie about Israel, use anti-Semitic tropes, knowing they can say whatever they want as elected members of Congress, and that the leadership of Congress won't take them down on that kind of rhetoric, the signals abound that you can get away with it.
And Rabbi Cooper says it's imperative that Christians stand by Jews and speak out strongly against the attacks, and that the White House must do more to stop it. Dale Hurd, CBN News. Here's more with Rabbi Abraham Cooper about this alarming rise of anti-Semitism, not only in the U.S., but around the world. Rabbi Cooper, what's your reaction to the anti-Semitic attacks in the U.S., from New York all the way to where you are in Los Angeles?
Actually, the tsunami started first in Germany, where they had attacks across the country. Hearing in the streets of Germany, "Death to Jews," has a special added component. In Dusseldorf, there was even a fire started at a memorial to the Dusseldorf synagogue that was arsoned on Kristallnacht in 1938. The situation in the UK is completely out of control. The type of attacks going on both sides of the Atlantic, and you can throw in Australia as well. It's a kind of perfect storm, extremely disconcerting. This is an anti-Semitism really escalating on a whole nother level.
Final question, Rabbi Cooper, how can evangelical Christians help?
I think, first and foremost, that next Sunday, there needs to be using the sermon to educate the parishioners, first, not so much about Israel. You don't really have to. They're light years ahead of everybody else. But about the scourge of anti-Semitism in the United States, that's really out of control. Their prayers will be very important. And then the other thing is to remember what so many people, including Mr. Wiesenthal, our namesake, the great Nazi hunter, would always remind us, that it often starts with Jews, it never ends with Jews. Our best friends are members of the Christian community. We just need them to be themselves, to be aware of what's going on, and to report to us what they see online and what they hear. We're never going to defeat anti-Semitism alone. It's going to be our neighbors who are going to lead the way.
Bill, if we look at the issue of anti-Semitism in the United States, now we know we've had pockets of it before. We had an element rise after the Wall Street crash in '29 in the early '30s, but pretty much it's been pretty dormant in the United States. And then we saw really, I think just after President Trump came into office, we saw a vandalization of Jewish synagogues. Then we saw that horrendous attack by a lone gunman at a Jewish synagogue, I think in Pennsylvania. And now we're seeing, with this latest conflict that Israel's had with Hamas, these anti-Semitic attacks go right across the United States. And pretty much a decade ago, you would have said that America was immune from this toxic disease of anti-Semitism, but it's come to your shores. Do you think that your political leaders and others are completely aware of the dangers of this spirit and what this spirit does, not only to its own Jewish community, but what it does to the society and the nation itself?
Yeah, I think they do. But the Biden administration they spoke against it. They said something at the UN. They said something in Congress. But unfortunately, you got 4 members of Congress that are pro-Muslim. You've got Omar and Talib, if I pronounce her name correctly, and then this AC Angela, whatever her name is, the lady from New York. That group, the squad, they're very anti-Israel and Jewish community, and it's a big problem, and that's it's just amazing. The level of animosity that we're seeing, and it's at all counts, and it's political division, it's moral division, it's diabolic. And you know how the enemy, when he sits in a situation like this or sees a situation like this, and it's very toxic, he takes advantage of it. And I think a lot of people are sensing that. And there's just a lot of animosity, a lot of political division, like I never thought we'd see. I'd never thought we'd see it, Simon. So it's very problematic. And unfortunately, a lot of times the Jewish people are the ones targeted. And I don't know if this administration is taken serious or will be strong enough to stand up against that.
And Bill, on to really the kind of big question of the program. So we're seeing political chaos in Israel. We're seeing political chaos in your country, in the United States, despite the fact that the Democrats have a majority in both houses and essentially have kind of unprecedented power at the moment, as much power as any administration is going to have. And we see turmoil. We see the world completely different prior to COVID-19, and it feels like a different world, 2019 to where we are today. So, and we're seeing this horrendous rise of evil and lawlessness around the world. Do you think that we are seeing the intensification of what Jesus spoke about in Matthew 24 as the beginning of the birth pains?
Absolutely. When you have in our problems, as well as probably in the UK as well, is we're the Judeo-Christian values, the biblical worldview of the right and wrong. And as I mentioned earlier, Isaiah 5:20, when woe to those that call good evil, or evil good and good evil. When we're at a time like this, and that's really this rebellious spirit, this lack of morals and values, the fact that the millennials, according to George Barna, only 1% of millennials have a biblical worldview. And I'm sure the next generation as well is 1% or less. And, that's the breakdown in America, is when we have moved away from those principles of the scripture, the Bible, Old Testament, New Testament. It leads to rebellion and disruption, chaos, apostasy as well. And this is Jacob's trouble. This is end time tribulation. This is just all coming to that conclusion. I don't see it getting better. I hope it would. But at this point, it just keeps getting worse and worse. So very likely we are very close to the beginning of the final 7 years. Only God knows the timing.
Amen to that. And but both of us are very passionate about our nations. I'm very passionate about Britain as well as the United States, because our two nations for over a century have stood for freedom and fought against tyranny and evil around the world. We stopped together the rise of German imperialism across Europe during the First World War. We stopped Hitler in his tracks during the Second World War, and again kept the Soviets at bay during the Cold War. But now it seems that our nations have moved so far away from their biblical heritage in our Judeo-Christian society that we are living in a post Christian society. So do you think there is any hope left for our nations in the West when they've completely abandoned God? They have completely abandoned their support for Israel. And we've seen this in this recent conflict. I mean, the British government was saying that they just want everything must be done to stop the violence, not taking Israel's position. The same in the States, but credit due to your Secretary of State Blinken, who stood up to Biden and now enabled Israel to have a longer period of time to destroy Hamas's terrorist infrastructure in order before a ceasefire came in. So can you see any hope in our nations when we've turned our back on God and we haven't blessed God's people, the Jewish people and Israel?
Well, that's a good question, Simon. And I think that's a bit of a conversation here in the U.S. We have a part of the church that believes that we're going to have one great final revival. And for that to happen, in my opinion, we would have to have a level of catastrophe much greater than even COVID, because that didn't do it. Some people thought it might do it, but it didn't do it. Our government, the Federal Reserve, threw a lot of money at the problem, so that kind of kicked the can down the road. That's number one. The other part of the church, which I think I tend to be more part of, is we are rapidly moving into the final day period of tribulation, the possible 7-year peace covenant, and prior to that, the Lord's return for us. So it's either revival and hope, or the blessed hope of this accelerating into a period of time of great tribulation and the Lord's return. So that's kind of where we stand right now. But I tell you, it would have to be, in order to have that revival, it's not going to be a feel-good revival. It'd have to be something on the heels of something very catastrophic. So I don't know the answer yet. Again, I think we're at that point. It's kind of hard to, to take back territory for Judeo-Christian Christians that are conservative, to take back territory that we've lost over the last 8 to 10 years in these moral areas. So I'm not optimistic there. But I don't know. It's going to be very interesting to me. We certainly see the signs, Simon. You and I have been at this a long time. All the signs are about us. We're just waiting for a catalyst or two to take this to a whole different level.
The other big question I need to raise, and we're down to the last 10 minutes of the program, Bill, and that is the leadership of US evangelicals after having unprecedented access to the White House, having the ear of the president, now find themselves completely cut off from the White House and Washington with this Democrat Biden administration. The fact that Biden held a national day of prayer, I think, without even mentioning God in it, is just ludicrous. But what is the crisis within the evangelical Christian leadership in the States, knowing the situation that they find themselves in the States with a new administration that is increasingly anti-Israel and anti-God, as it were?
I told some of those leaders that President Trump's peace plan needs to be stopped. Jared Kushner was the one that was pushing this, the peace to prosperity plan, the deal of the century. And I said, along with Michelle Bachmann and a few others, told the leadership, which she was even part of, don't attempt to create an Arab state in Judea and Samaria and divide Jerusalem. If you do, based on my book, Eye to Eye, there will be consequences. January 28th, last year, look at what America and Israel in the international world was like prior to that peace deal being delivered on January 28th of last year. That same day, and within 24 hours, President Trump established his coronavirus task force. I mean, they were finishing it that day on the 28th. As he's introducing the peace plan, they're developing this task force. And look at the chaos that the coronavirus created for the United States, Israel, the UK, and the world. And what's interesting is right after Trump gave his plan, Boris Johnson, Macron, in the next 2 or 3 days, they all established their plan, which was the UN, or they all confirmed their plan, which was the UN Resolution 242 and 338. Trump gives his plan on January 28th, and then the leaders of Europe and around the world are saying, no, we have a plan, a two-state plan. It's our plan. And then the Abraham Accord on September 15th last year, that created chaos. We had chaos that was associated with that as well. So what happened here is these leaders that had all this access that I lobbied say, don't or stop the peace process. Because if you continue this, there's going to be consequences to the United States and Israel. The good news is it's accelerating us to the final days in the Lord's return. But right now we're suffering the consequences of attempting to divide the covenant land. So these people that had enormous access for 4 years have no access now, because the coronavirus led to vote by mail, voter fraud, and the defeat of President Trump, despite how it happened. And it's still being litigated in the courts here in America. But when he introduced his plan on dividing the land of Israel, and his map that superimposed the map of Genesis 15:18, life as we know it in America and Israel changed dramatically. And then on the heels of that, the Abraham Accord. And that's a disruption we're looking at right now politically in the United States and Israel and around the world. It's still a consequence of attempting to divide that land.
So as Christians, Bill, and certainly our viewers watching this program, how do we respond to that challenge, knowing that effectively a curse has fallen upon the United States, which is the world's only remaining world superpower? And without America being the world's policeman on that world stage, the world looks like a very, very scary place without the United States being a powerful force to push back the rise of evil and totalitarian regimes that are emerging throughout the world.
Well, we can look to Genesis 12:3. If our administration would say, I don't expect this, we don't expect this, that Israel has the biblical right to all of Judea and Samaria and all of Jerusalem, and that the original agreement is the San Remo agreement that was on the heels of the Balfour Agreement, and that is the law in the books. That's what Secretary of State Pompeo said when they said that the Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria are not illegal based on the San Remo Agreement. And if we do the right thing and say that Israel has the full biblical right to all of that land and all of Jerusalem, the blessing will be enormous. It would be absolutely enormous to the United States and also Israel and whoever else would support that. Unfortunately, I don't think that's going to happen, Simon, but that's a way to reverse the curse and to reverse the judgment of what we're under right now.
Certainly something to think about, and we've seen the Lord use to raise up prophets in the Old Testament. That I mean, you only have to look at the story of Jonah. It comes to mind when he was told to go to Nineveh, a very evil empire that oppressed the Jewish people and murdered babies and children. And you can see why Jonah was fearful about telling Nineveh to repent. So, of course, we have biblical examples that we can look to for where this is happening. But it seems that the nations are determined to go down this antichrist route, this anti-God route, determined to empower Israel's enemies. And that can't be good for the West, can it? And that can't be good for peace and stability, not only in the Middle East, but also in the West.
Yeah, we're rapidly seeing the final day markers: one world political order, one world religious order, one world currency, digital currency, the technology for the mark of the beast of Revelation 13. We're hearing about all the World Economic Forum's reset plan. We're hearing about the possibility P5+1, that's Germany, France, Russia, the UK, and the United States coming up with a new Iran nuclear deal. We're living in that time that the Bible speaks of. So I don't see how it changes. It was interesting. I spoke to a church recently in Texas by Zoom. And one of the ladies in the audience says, this is before the election. If Trump gets elected, it'll be like a speed bump to the Great Reset. If Biden gets elected, it'll be like being on the Autobahn to the Great Reset. And I think right now that's where we are, biblically, scripturally. And a pastor in Dallas, W.A. Criswell, used to always say, if you want to know where things stand, watch what they're doing with the city of Jerusalem. And even the state of Israel, God's time clock. So, what an exciting day, Simon, when you look at it from that perspective. I mean, it's our generation. And I know how excited you can be and I can be watching these events. I mean, it's problematic to see what's happening in our countries and Israel. But at the same time, this is very, very exciting period of time because our Lord's coming soon.
Absolutely. And I think that is the hope that we actually draw from looking at a world in chaos and a world in turmoil, is that the blessed hope or the pre-trib rapture is just around the corner. So just coming to the end of the program now, Bill, I just want to thank you so much for your time. I love the work that you do, and particularly warning Christian leaders and also those in the former administration under President Bush about the dangers of dividing the land of Israel and proposing a peace plan that's not based upon God's principles and God's viewpoint, as it were, according to scripture, which is very, very dangerous. So thank you for being my guest on the Middle East Report.
Thanks, Simon. Today. God bless you and keep up the good work as well.
Thank you. And I just want to thank you for watching this program today. It's a great honor that we can have Bill Koenig on the Middle East report to explain the spiritual dangers of dividing God's land and scattering his people. And that's why, as we see this unprecedented rise of Jew hatred around the world, that Israel again is being internationally isolated, that as Christians we stand in that gap and we show that friendship towards Israel and the Jewish people as they're under siege. So it's imperative that as Christians we stand for the truth, and that is standing with Israel and the Jewish people. So thank you for watching this home edition of the Middle East Report.